Hello, I'm Robin Dennison. I'm going to be talking to you today about motivation and motivating students for learning. This is a portion of Module 2 of 628. First of all, let's talk about the objectives for this particular webcast. And again, this is a component of Module 2. And the two objectives that we'll be talking about or focusing in on this particular webinar are to discuss the intrinsic and extrinsic motivational factors for learning, and also to describe strategies to motivate learners. So, definition of motivation. I like this one. It's quite complex, but it does a good job of kind of taking in the whole concept. And that is that motivation is a state of cognitive or emotional arousal, which leads to a conscious decision to act, and which gives rise to a period of sustained intellectual and or physical effort in order to attain a previously set goal or goals. Obviously, we're talking about learning and we're talking about intellectual efforts, but certainly the same definition could apply to a physical effort. So why is motivation important? First of all, it's a lot easier to teach a learner who is highly motivated than one who is not motivated. And the thought that always comes to my mind when I look at that is, having to teach mandatory in-services. And there's really not a whole lot of things worse than teaching mandatory in-services, because you have people who are there because they must be there and not because they want to be there. And it's difficult. Motivated learners make more mental effort. They are more likely to use available learning resources. And what comes to my mind there, of course, are your recommended readings on your module assignments. Certainly, those motivated learners are going to make sure that they read not only the recommended or the required assignments, but also the recommended assignments. And the resultant learning of motivated learning is more long-term. It's going to last a lot longer. I know that in the last Nurse Educator course you talked about deep and then surface learning. And I just want to review that with you, because obviously when we're talking about motivated learning, we're talking about that we're more likely to achieve that deep learning. So surface learners are more likely to memorize for the test. They can't really distinguish principles from the examples, and they tend to focus on discrete facts without integration. A word of warning about that, and that is, if you test facts, then you train learners to memorize facts. If you test critical thinking and application, then you emphasize to the learner that those things are really important and that they need to know that. So when we talk about evaluation, just kind of keep that in mind, that when you're writing your tests, you want to make sure that you're writing them for decision-making application and not necessarily just asking the student to memorize minutia. So also, surface learning, there's a lack of reflection about purpose and strategy. There's a lot of anxiety because, again, it's mostly memorizing, and they have very low long-term retention. If we talk about deep learning, then we're talking about active search for meaning, really applying it to what they already know, relating it to previous knowledge, relating the concepts to everyday experience. How can I use this? What does this mean to me? And it builds confidence, and it certainly builds longer retention. So that's our goal. So this is an interesting illustration that I found to kind of show different types of motivation. Obviously, at the very top is what we call intrinsic motivation. And that's the highest level of motivation, where motivation is internally generated. And it is that search for knowledge's sake, for that feel good that the individual has by acquiring that knowledge. The next level is what we call integrated regulation. and that is where regulations are adopted into one's values and needs, but they're also contingent upon reward. And of course, reward is an extrinsic motivation. Regulation through identification is when the behavior is personally important but contingent upon an external reward. So for instance, either these, well, especially this one, regulation through identification, is possibly that trying to achieve that degree, for instance, because it's personally important for my career goals. Interjected regulation is when behaviors are not fully accepted as one's own, and then external regulation, behaviors performed to satisfy external demand or reward, again, mandatory in services. And then finally, at the very end, is amotivation, where there's a total lack of intent to act. This is from some work by Stephen Rice, who is at Ohio State, and when he looks at intrinsic motivation, all of these things kind of come into play in terms of basic motivational theory. I found this quite interesting because it reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, particularly in some areas when you talk about, for instance, romance and family, and I just find this whole list very interesting. It certainly is quite encompassing. So I found the vengeance one quite interesting. That's interesting motivation to act, vengeance. Curiosity, good motivation to act, and so on. So I thought you'd enjoy that list. So let's talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivational factors. So with extrinsic, some factors might be, for instance, in terms of education, to gain a credential, to be able to progress in an educational process, like good grades, academic progression. Approval or proof of ability. What came to mind as I looked at that is certainly certifications, for instance, where you have that recognition, builds on your self-esteem, and then finally also association and social being able to participate in social activities. On the intrinsic side is the motivation from within to develop skills that are certainly relevant to your career or your job, but mostly just that kind of, again, feel good about what you're doing. Intellectual achievement, that self-satisfaction, mastery, challenge, like to be challenged. Self-improvement for personal growth, and then also association here in relationship to the community of practice, so your work group, for instance. This particular illustration is from some of the business literature, and this was some work done by Hellsberg, where he found that when you looked at extrinsic factors like pay, benefits, job security, working conditions, company policies, human relations, those were motivating factors related to dissatisfaction, not satisfaction. Intrinsic motivators were more likely to make you satisfied. So what does that mean? That means if you don't have adequate pay, adequate benefits, job security, etc., you are likely to be dissatisfied. But if you have those things, they are not likely to make you satisfied. On the other hand, if you have those intrinsic motivating factors, the joy of doing the work, recognition, achievement, those are things that are much more likely to make you satisfied. The absence of them makes you not satisfied, the absence of satisfaction. But there is a difference between dissatisfied and not satisfied. And this comes up too in the YouTube video, the TED Talks webcast that is in your assignment for this week too. And what we know is that more pay doesn't necessarily motivate people. particularly in the workplace. Extrinsic reward then, as educators, one of the key external rewards that we have, or extrinsic rewards that we have, are points. You know, do I get points for that? Will it be on the test? Will I get points? So what we do know about extrinsic rewards is that they do, to some degree, depress intrinsic motivation. They narrow the focus and they lessen creativity. They are, though, helpful when there's a reluctance to engage. So again, I bring up the mandatory in-service. They can be a bridge to intrinsic motivation, because what may happen is the individual may do something because they have to, and then find they actually do enjoy it or they're interested in it. So there are two key things that come into play with motivation that we're going to talk about. One, of course, is relevance, and then the other one is self-efficacy. So related to relevance, extrinsic motivation is what's in it for me, what am I going to get, is it consistent with my goals. Intrinsically, that we want to know, is it challenging, is it interesting, is it useful? So challenging, does it have attainment value? Interest value is interesting. Utility value, is it useful? And of course, what we want to do is design learning that is interesting, challenging, and useful. So again, in relationship to relevance, we do understand that new things are put into context with what we already know. And it's very important that learners be able to take new information and integrate it with old information from their memory. And failure to integrate really does lead to just memorization and shallow knowledge. Strategies that help in terms of ensuring relevance to learners are using analogies, and I know that you all know how effective it is to use analogies and examples with students. We often talk too about storytelling, or the interesting term for that now is narrative pedagogy, that students really do integrate things well when they hear stories, analogies, examples. Also, it's helpful if you can solicit experiences from the learner. You know, what experience do you have with this, and then build on that, relate to the meaning for that particular learner. And then also associate facts with principles. The next important point is self-efficacy, and I really do love this quote from Henry Ford: whether you think you can or you can't, you're usually right. When I do certification reviews and I hear a lot of people say, oh, I just don't think I can pass, I just don't think I can pass. And that becomes what we know is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Back to, again, Henry Ford: if you think you can't, you're probably right. So we have to really build students up and help them know that they can. And possibly this kind of crosses over into that concept of inspiring, but certainly we want students to feel like they can succeed. So self-efficacy is that belief that you can do it, belief about the future based on your past experiences. I could do this, I'm sure I can do that. To attribute one's success to ability, effort, and knowledge. Interestingly, we do know that we have some people who, this is called the shadow side, where they become overconfident and underprepared. And I'm sorry to say that the best example I can give you there are with a lot of new graduates. And that is that they don't know what they don't know. And so what happens is they become extremely overconfident while they are still underprepared, and they can certainly become a safety hazard without a doubt. So influences on self-efficacy, the first thing there is mastery experiences, and that is past experience of either success or failure. Vicarious experience, we often talk about living vicariously through someone else. So vicarious experiences observe someone that we identify with succeeding or failing. And then social persuasion, encouragement from a trusted friend or mentor. That's us, right? We want to be inspiring to our students. And then optimal arousal, is that we're relaxed, alert, and enthused. Remember that we often talk about arousal anxiety, and that is that we do know that some degree of anxiety is actually necessary for students to learn. So we want them to gain confidence. So they have to believe in their competence, and that those beliefs actually determine the amount of effort that the learner will extend. If they feel that they can't ever achieve this particular level of knowledge, of competency, then it's very discouraging to them, and they probably will not put the effort out because they feel like no matter what they do, they can't succeed. On the other hand, if they feel that they can, then they make that effort and they can succeed. I firmly believe, and you will know by reading my teaching philosophy, that it is absolutely necessary to ask students to stretch. You certainly don't want them to ask them, you don't want to ask them to do what they already know how to do. We want them to stretch and grow. Otherwise, what is the purpose of education? But we want them to succeed, and that is incremental stretching, right? Stretch a little bit, succeed, yay! And then again, another little stretch. So strategies related to self-efficacy theory focus on individual improvement, progress, and mastery. Obviously, evaluation should be private, not public. You want to encourage their efforts, provide opportunities for improvement, and then also encourage viewing of mistakes as part of learning. One of the things that I think is just tragic, and I do know this happens, is when teachers do not allow students to view their examination, for instance. They see no more than just a score on their grade book, and I think that's appalling. Students need to be able to look at those questions and say, why did I get this wrong? Why did I get this right? Let me ask you questions about this item. That doesn't mean I encourage them to come and argue with me about questions, but I do want to know, I want them to know why they missed that question and how they can kind of grow from that particular item failure. That encourages growth. They need to see those mistakes as part of their growing process. So again, if we go back to designing for motivation, you have two components, relevance and self-efficacy. And with relevance, we're trying to grab their attention, and we're trying to have them look back at prior knowledge, identify their own goals, have them choose how they're going to get to those goals, identify the learning gap, you know, what do they have to do to get to that level that they want to be at, and then also emotion to engage. I think that it's very important for students to feel that we care that they succeed. And then self-efficacy, the metacognition, you know, that thing about talking about how you learn and being able to develop through that process of learning more about how you learn. Recounting past successes, feedback and encouragement, and then also notice it says learner-to-learner dialogue. Certainly teacher-to-learner dialogue is important, but also students learn so much from other learners and develop through that process. So this is an interesting design where this particular one related to e-learning, but it really relates to anything. And that is that while we want to challenge students, we want them to achieve a level of mastery and success. And then again, ask them to stretch and achieve that level of achievement, to get to that level of achievement and mastery. And then again, another new challenge. So it's very important that they have those periods where they feel like they have really accomplished something. This is from an interesting study where they asked students about their motivation within the college classroom. The first one is enthusiasm, and they say, how can teachers expect us to be interested in a topic if they don't seem interested? And I think this is so true. If you cannot communicate enthusiasm on a topic, then certainly students are not going to be enthusiastic about that topic. Relevance. that they can relate it to their previous life and their future life, right? How is this applicable to me? It's all about me. How is this applicable to me? Organization, we can, they want to know that we're organized in the way that we present information, but they also want to know that we care about the work that they've done. We can see that in terms of we can see that they've done their homework. They want to know that we come in prepared. They don't want to think that, we just come to class and wing it. The other part of that too, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is they also want to know that we really care about their assignments. No busy work, right? That we have time on task. Appropriate difficulty level, they don't want to be bored. But at the same time, they want to make sure that they want to feel like the class is fair and passable. They do like active learning. They may not know they like active learning because a lot of times our students have been socialized to lecture and they feel like that's the easiest. Just let me come in and sit in this chair and you just fill my head up. Well, it doesn't work that way. We know that. And over time, they do get to really enjoy active learning. They like variety and teaching learning strategies and so on. They don't want to come in and feel like it's the same old thing every day. Wouldn't that be tragic? Every day you come to class, you get 4 hours of lecture with PowerPoint. And then rapport, that the teacher is approachable and friendly, and again, that they really care about the learner. And finally, examples and analogies. They love that. Okay. Now, this is Keller's ARCS model, and I think that we talked about this a bit in your first nurse educator course, but maybe not. The first thing is attention, and that is what can you do to get their attention and stimulate curiosity. Relevance, show how relevant it is. Confidence, that they have multiple achievement levels that allow them to set their personal goals. And then finally, satisfaction with integrating that new knowledge into either a real or simulated setting. And of course, in the next nurse educator course, you're going to learn a whole lot more about the whole simulation process. So strategies: use unexpected and novel approaches. And again, that kind of shakes things up and stimulates the learner. Use engaging problems. Vary your presentation style. Relate learning to personal goals. Build on previous positive experiences that the learner has had, and also build expectation through establishing what the goals and objectives of the course are, and then allow for practice. The earlier we practice, or even just restate or rewrite what we've learned, it helps us to remember it and integrate it. The next two slides are a couple things that I found on the web, which I don't know what it is. I love, lists. Maybe it's, Letterman in the top 10 list, but I love it when I see things listed. And so this was a list of 5 ways to motivate your learners. First of all, number 1, reward your learners. And there are 2 major ways that we reward learners. One, of course, is in points and grades, but the other is in just positive statements that we make. One of the things that I've noticed over the last few years is that I've emailed students to ask them if I can use their paper or their poster as an exemplar for the students I have now or the students I'm going to have next semester. They love that. I mean, they're so appreciative that, wow, you really want to use my paper as an exemplar. So when they do a good job, let them know they did a good job. Make sure that your course has real value. And sometimes you have to let students know that this course has value. I used to teach leadership and management for undergraduate students, and they did not see the value in that course because in their mind it was not blood and guts. It was not important on NCLEX, and they just felt like it was a big old waste of time. And I had to constantly talk about, how is this information going to be useful to you? How is this information going to be useful to you? Yes, questions like this are on NCLEX, but also you may very well be the QI person on your unit after you graduate. So you have to really work hard to show them that this course has value. And of course it should be. No busy work. Help them perform better. And that a lot of that is giving feedback. Set clear expectations for the course and for assignments. As you know and will know, I am a big proponent of having very clear rubrics so that students know what the expectation of the assignment is. And then number 5 I thought was quite interesting, and the point was to tell them they're wrong, but that is in essence to stimulate controversy and debate, because that helps us it helps get attention, but it also motivates us to look at something from different angles or different perspectives. This is the next list. Number 1, make it real. Number 2, provide choices in how they learn and even how they're evaluated. That one course that I mentioned on leadership and management, I actually allowed students to choose how they would be evaluated. And each individual student got to choose how they would be evaluated. So I had almost like a menu, and it said, okay, I'll take this test, and I'll do this presentation. Okay, I only want to take one test, and then I'll do a presentation, and I'll do a paper. And I had like a menu approach in how many points that particular assignment would earn them. And of course the goal was 100 possible of the choices that they made. It was fun. I won't say that it was an absolute complete success the first time around. And sometimes students just want to be told, this is how many tests you're going to have and this is what you're going to have to do. But it was quite interesting because what I wanted them to make the choices where their strengths were. There's a wonderful book called Now Discover Your Strengths. And the point of that book, which is what I was basing my strategy on, was that we shouldn't be focusing so much on students' weaknesses and making them strong in an area where they're really weak. We need to focus on their strengths and help them develop those strengths. So if they're poor test takers, yes, I know NCLEX is there and they're going to have to take NCLEX, but yes, they have to take one test, but they don't have to take 5 tests, and they are strong in writing papers or they're strong in doing presentations, then let them use those strengths. Balance the challenge, and again, have them stretch but not break. Seek and use role models. Establish a sense of belonging, and that is they're a part of this class, they're part of this group. One of the things that has always been so inspiring to me personally is when I have students come back and say, I felt like a nurse today. And I always wonder, well, what was it that gave you that feeling, that made you say, I felt like a nurse today? I don't know if you remember that feeling of when you first felt like a nurse, but when you hear a student say that, it's just overwhelming, and it always is, to me, quite an emotional point when they really start to feel like a nurse. Be supportive. Get to know your students and show genuine care. That particular leadership management course that I was talking about, I had 150 students. I admit I did not know all their names. I knew the really good ones and I knew the bad ones. I did not know the ones in between. And so there are times when you cannot possibly really do this because of course size. But most of us don't have course sizes of 150, thank goodness. And we really can get to know our students and what's important to them, what's motivating them. And then also strategizing with struggling students, especially when you have English as a second language students. They struggle. And to keep up with, even listening, they're processing while you've moved on to say something else. And so trying to come up with ways that they can succeed. Maybe that's making sure that you have MP3s available so they can play them in the car and they can listen to the lectures on multiple times to help them succeed. what resources are available on your campus to help them in terms of their writing skills and so on. So if students are struggling, number one, they need to know that you care that they're struggling and you want them to succeed. And then again, strategize with them ways that they can succeed. And what we want, of course, are all of our students to succeed and reach the top of that mountain. And so that concludes this presentation on motivation, and I hope we have some lively discussion about it in the live seminars. Thank you.